Everyone thinks war destroys retirement plans. That money evaporates. Markets crash, savings disappear, and if you're unlucky enough to retire during wartime, you're screwed for life. That's the story we tell ourselves. But here's what almost nobody knows. Some of the wealthiest retirements in American history happened during wars, not despite the conflict, because of it. And the data behind this will completely change how you think about timing, risk, and what actually protects wealth when everything falls apart. Before we dig into what history actually shows, quick pause. If understanding money during the moments that matter most is valuable to you, help a duck in a suit spread the word. Subscribe. More people need to see this before the next crisis hits. All right, let's go back to December 1941. Pearl Harbor just happened. America enters World War II. Markets are in chaos. Uncertainty everywhere. Now imagine you're 65 years old. You just retired. Your entire life savings is in the stock market. Every financial advisor would tell you that you picked the worst possible time to stop working. You're finished. But here's what actually happened. If you retired in 1942 with $100,000 invested and withdrew 4% annually, adjusted for inflation, by 1952, your portfolio would have been worth more than when you started. Not survived, grown. During a world war. How is that possible? Because while everyone focused on fear, three things quietly saved retirements. First, wartime production exploded. Factories ran non-stop. Unemployment dropped to nearly zero. Corporate profits soared. The stock market followed. Second, the government issued war bonds. Safe, guaranteed returns that gave retirees stability while stocks recovered. Third, inflation was controlled through rationing and price controls. Your dollar actually held value. So retirees had income from bonds, growth from stocks, and purchasing power that didn't collapse. The war didn't destroy their plans. It created one of the strongest economic periods in modern history. But let's test this. Was World War II just a lucky outlier? Let's look at another war, Vietnam. The conflict ran from 1965 to 1975, a decade of instability, protests, political chaos, and rising inflation. Now imagine you retire in 1965 right as troops deploy. Terrible timing again, right? Wrong. If you retired in 1965 with a balanced portfolio and stuck to a 4% withdrawal rate, your money would have lasted through the entire war and well into the 1980s. Yes, there were rough years. 1973 and 1974 were brutal for markets. But retirees who stayed invested, didn't panic, and kept withdrawing conservatively made it through. The war didn't end their retirement. Panic would have. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's jump to the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991. Short conflict, but massive uncertainty. Oil prices spiked. Markets dropped 17% in 3 months. If you had just retired in 1990, you would have watched your portfolio get hammered immediately. But here's the thing. The war ended quickly. Markets recovered fast, and the 1990s became one of the best decades for retirees in history. The S&P 500 averaged over 18% annual returns through that decade. Retirees who stayed calm during the Gulf War didn't just survive, they thrived. So why does everyone think war kills retirement? Because we remember the fear, not the outcomes. We remember the headlines, the panic, the uncertainty. But history shows something completely different. Wars don't destroy retirement savings. Bad decisions during wars do. Selling at the bottom, pulling everything into cash, stopping contributions, letting fear override strategy. That's what kills wealth, not the conflict itself. Now here's the part that almost nobody talks about, and it's the most important lesson in all of this. The retirements that failed during wartime didn't fail because of the war. They failed because of what people did before the war started. If you retired with no diversification, no bonds, no cash reserves, and 100% in stocks, yeah, a market crash during war could wreck you. But that's not a war problem. That's a planning problem. The people who made it through wars successfully had something in common. They built resilient portfolios before the crisis hit. They had multiple income sources, They had flexibility, they had time. But there's one war we haven't talked about yet, and it's the one that actually did break retirements. The war that proved timing and preparation matter more than anything else. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, who got destroyed, and why it's the exception that proves the rule. But first, you need to understand what made this war different from every other conflict in American history. Because if you don't know this story, you won't understand the real risk. And that's what part 2 is about. The war that actually destroyed retirements wasn't World War II, it wasn't Vietnam, it wasn't the Gulf War, it was the war that most people don't even think of as a war, the Cold War. Specifically, the period from the late 1970s into the early 1980s, when inflation became the enemy, and the government had to fight it like a war. And this one was different, because the weapons used to fight inflation, interest rate hikes, economic slowdowns, those weapons hurt retirees directly. Here's what happened. In the late 1970s, inflation was out of control. It hit 13.5% in 1980. If you retired in 1978 or 1979, your cost of living was rising faster than your portfolio could keep up. A gallon of milk that cost $1.50 in 1978 cost $2.16 by 1980. Your rent, your utilities, your medicine, everything doubled in just a few years, and your fixed income from bonds or pensions couldn't adjust fast enough. Social Security had cost of living adjustments, but they lagged. If you didn't have substantial stock exposure, you got crushed. But here's the cruel irony. If you did have stocks, you also got crushed. Because to kill inflation, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to nearly 20%. That destroyed the stock market. From 1978 to 1982, the market went nowhere. Flat, no growth. So retirees were trapped. Inflation eating their purchasing power on one side, stagnant portfolios on the other. No escape. This is the only modern period where retiring at the wrong time could genuinely ruin you. Not because of a war overseas, because of a war on inflation at home. And the people who survived it had one thing in common. They didn't retire right before it started. They either retired earlier in the 1970s and had time to adjust, or they waited until the early 1980s when inflation finally broke and the recovery began. Timing mattered. A retiree in 1975 had a few good years before inflation hit and could build a cushion. A retiree in 1983 caught the beginning of one of the greatest bull markets in history. But a retiree in 1979, brutal. So here's the lesson. Wars, real wars with troops and bombs, historically, haven't destroyed retirements. Economic wars, the ones fought with interest rates and monetary policy, those are the ones that hurt. Because you can't diversify away from inflation. You can't hide from interest rates. The entire system moves against you at once. And that's the risk most people don't prepare for. Now, let's bring this to today. We're not in a shooting war on American soil, but we are in a period of global tension, rising geopolitical risk, conflict in Eastern Europe, tension in the Middle East, uncertainty about what happens next. So if you're near retirement or already retired, what does history actually tell you to do? First, diversification isn't optional. Stocks, bonds, commodities, real estate, cash. You need exposure to assets that perform differently under different conditions. The retirees who made it through wars had this. The ones who didn't. Second, don't panic sell. Every war in modern history has been followed by recovery. The investors who stayed won. The ones who bailed locked in losses they never recovered from. Third, have cash reserves. Not your whole portfolio, but enough to cover 1 to 2 years of expenses without selling stocks. This lets you ride out the chaos without being forced to sell at the bottom. Fourth, inflation protection matters more than you think. Tips: commodities, real assets. If inflation spikes during conflict, this is what saves you. But here's the most important takeaway, and it's the one that almost nobody gets. The question isn't, can you retire during a war? The question is, did you build a retirement that can survive anything? Because history shows that wars, crashes, inflation, recessions, they all happen. The retirees who make it aren't the ones who avoid crisis. They're the ones who built plans resilient enough to survive crisis. And that work happens before the crisis,
not during. So, if you're watching this and you're not retired yet, your job isn't to predict the next war. It's to build a
portfolio and a plan that doesn't care if one happens. Diversify, stay invested, control spending, build cash reserves, protect against inflation. Do that, and history says you'll be fine. Not lucky, prepared. And if you're already retired, same rules apply. Don't panic. Don't sell everything. Stick to your plan. Adjust if you have to, but don't abandon the strategy that got you here. Because the retirements that failed during wars didn't fail because of bad luck. They failed because of bad decisions made in fear. And that's something you can control. The war you can't predict. Your response, that's entirely